So this is an incomplete project of mine, and that is hanging up stuff that I've broken, destroyed over the years. A lot of it, I've got a lot of stuff that's newcomers to the pile over the past couple of years. It's just laying on the ground here. I threw it in the general direction. I've got to make the wall bigger to hang more parts. I got this one pretty well full. I still do reuse my broken parts as much as I can. If there's any way I can use something, I'm gonna reuse it. So a lot of my 4-link arms, I don't know how many dozen 4-link arms I've bent and mangled. I usually reuse them. A lot of the bent tubes you'll find on anything I made might be a broken or a bent 4-link bar. I just cut the heims off, use the bend in the tube. They usually look pretty cool. This one doesn't, that's a kink. So that's a pretty good, it's almost a 90 there. Anyway, it doesn't really matter what I put under it. A lot of it is bent and broke. This is quarter wall stuff. You can see that this bar here, I temporarily fixed. I straightened it. You could see it was bowed out right here. And I straightened it in the middle of a show. Then I put a piece of angle iron on the other side and welded it solid. And I went out and bent it right at the end of the angle iron there. So that went on the wall. It was extra heavy. This 4-link bar here is a complete 90. So that one's something to be proud of right there. And that's from the long jump I did that Sale was supposed to do at Dennis Anderson's. So he had his world record jump and he backed out of it at the last minute and I was ready to go. So I went for it, and that was one of the many broken parts when I was done. There, made that beautiful 90, and I just left the heims on there. I could probably reuse those. I might need those for something one day, but as of now, that's a good piece for my museum. What do we got here? This is a experiment that I just cut off. There's nothing wrong with it, I guess, besides that it was just a backwards ID to begin with. This was a bump stop I made. It was a spring inside a plate with a little can and some chains. I don't know. I was being creative. I was on there for a while, you know. I don't know if it did anything besides weigh me down. This is a piston that's melted. That's just from when my barn burned down, so that was a souvenir from that. I don't know what it came out of. There's a drive shaft that just exploded. You can see where it was welded. It just bowed out and exploded. It probably broke on the other side. And no? Well, let's think about that. Who knows what happened? It exploded. I was driving. There's an old headlight. Here's a sheared sway bar. That's an expensive piece of steel that I just turned into a spike. This is when I used to break transmissions in half all the time. I've got lots of these bell housings that are cracked in half and charred. Here's an input shaft, or an output shaft for a SCS transfer case that I sheared. Did that when I did a huge backflip. Landed that wide open and sheared that. Here's some 5-ton yokes that are just broken and shattered. There's more around. Here's one. Just ripped the ears off. This one totally ripped apart. Here's a melted down piston out of my Cummins 24 valve in my bus. That was my hauler till it exploded. And I rebuilt it, and it had all kinds of electronic issues. I don't know, maybe I forgot to hook something up when I was done. Here's a drive shaft I turned into a knot and sheared. Here's a bent valve out of my bulldozer. The other one is here, stuck in the piston. So that was pretty great. That was lots of fun to rebuild in the woods. Here's an F106 axle that's sheared on both sides. Here's a 2.5-ton U-joint that's sheared on both sides. More U-joints. That's an Axle Tech U-joint. Here's my duck. He used to live on my old radiator cap on the front of the Power Wagon. And I broke his head off right here when I did my first backflip at Dennis's. I broke his head off, and I had him welded back together. He had a weld around his neck. And then I broke him off again somewhere, I think in Florida. So that was the end of a duck. There's some bearings and bent heim joints and broken hydraulic fittings. Here's a piston that I blew apart. That's the center of it. That's a piston out of a shock. Just exploded and blew apart. bent steering cylinders. I've got piles. There's more bent shock tubes down there, broken axles down there on the floor. Here's a pile of bent 4-link arms. These are from a long jump that I did after I got my set of Overtime CNC shocks. And I went down to Dennis Anderson's all excited to show off my new shocks, and I'm doing this long world record jump, and I just totally blew the whole front end apart. This is good steel, but my arms were bent. You can see I just sheared that off, so that's pretty amazing. My arms were bent, my 4-link arms were bent, and I straightened them out and I sleeved them. I sleeved them with these big heavy tubes, and you can see this one is just the ugliest thing in the world, but that held up. That mess held up, and look what I did down here, and you can see that it was solid. That's an old shock tube. Remember, I told you I reuse everything. That's a solid shock shaft, and it's shoved inside there, and then double tubing over top, and this sheared off. You can see it split and sheared. I just blew the whole front end out of the truck when I landed, and all 4-link bars sheared and bent in like 20 spots. So they're down there for the museum. That's pretty neat. Here's a transmission from when I was breaking transmissions in half all the time. Here's an oil pan from when I blew my motor apart and I pulled a camper over a jump at Dennis Anderson's, and I just threw a rod out each side. Totally destroyed the engine block. Totally destroyed every single piece in it. And I got this cool oil pan as a souvenir. It looks like a bomb went off inside of it. Basically did. There's a 2.5-ton axle when I used to run those. I sheared them all. I broke every 2.5-ton axle I could ever find. Here's a shock shaft from when I was running shocks that were small shafts. And I didn't think I could ever get the shafts, and then I found out I could run bigger shafts. I had straightened this one like 3 times, and you can see it's a really neat piece. I think this happened in Vermonster. Here's a 2.5-ton axle that's clearly bent right here, and then sheared off. More bell housings broken off. Here's a piston from this explosion here. So you can see the rod broken in half, the piston's destroyed. Here's more 2.5-ton axles. Here's a shock piston that's wedged and jammed into the cap of the shock. Here's a pretty cool drive shaft that I sheared off. That's the slip yoke there, solid bar. Here's a 2.5-ton yoke. I've got piles of these. Here's an input shaft for a Turbo 400. Wait, no, what is that? What is that? I don't know what this is. What is that? I'm going to be here for 10 minutes. I don't know what that is. I'm not thinking straight right now. Splined with that. What would that be? It's got to be a pinion out of something. It's too small to be a pinion out of my truck. What would that be out of? I don't know what this is. I broke it, clearly. Here's a drive shaft I twisted up into a knot. When I first put my big motor in my truck, I put thin wall, it's regular drive shafts, but I took off at the line at Dennis Anderson's, and I was going to do the race, and I spun both drive shafts into a knot and threw them out. That was it. That was my whole run. Here's a bell housing that I broke in half. Here's another one I broke in half. You can see it split there. I've went through a lot of Turbo 400s. Here's a broken 2.5-ton axle or an F106 axle. There's my front fender. It hung on for a while, but it had to go eventually. Here's another shock piston. It's a center blown out of it. 2.5-ton flange. Another shock cap. This one doesn't look like it's in too bad a shape besides the fact that I owned it. Here's a timing cover that's split all the way around from when that motor rattled apart. More axles. Here's another 4-link bar that's just a real work of art. The Heim is just broke free in there. The whole thing is bent and wedged and split the whole way down until you get to where it eventually just sheared off. And once again, you could see it was double wall tubing, so quarter wall or more. And I just totally destroyed it. What's that? I don't know what this is, but I clearly destroyed it. What would this be? This is out of my 2.5-ton transmission. So that's the main shaft in my transmission and my deuce and a half. Sheared that. Here's more pistons and rods that are destroyed. Here is a Axle-Tech axle shaft that's broken, destroyed. Here's a cam out of the wiped out motor. You can guess what that is. I don't know. Something fell apart. Piece of a planetary, maybe. Look at this heim joint here. That's a real work of art. Yep, no reusing that one. 3/4 inch heim joints on the end of shocks. Those I've got so many. Bent and broke. Here's another shock shaft from my small shaft days. And they always turned into pretzels. They were just garbage. They didn't last long. And let's see. Come on over here. And this is ready to go on the wall. This is still just pulled off of my last explosion of my 540. Pistons and rods just totally destroyed and mangled. This one here's a beauty. I like that one. I should wear this as a necklace. It could be a wrapper. Here's a piece of my engine block. Here's some rod caps. Here's where some pieces blew out that side of the pan. Here's where some pieces blew out that side of the pan. Basically a bomb detonated in there.
Who are you talking to?
My girlfriend.
What?
Alright, so that's a wall of broken parts. Hopefully I can make some more soon. I'm sure I will. Thank you and goodbye.